Welcome to Verified Fears. Washington's rainforests hold secrets that defy explanation. Moss-covered giants stand silent in perpetual mist, ancient beyond memory. And deep within their shadows, people encounter things that shouldn't exist. These accounts come from search and rescue volunteers, park rangers, researchers, and ordinary hikers who ventured into the the Quinault, the Olympic wilderness, and returned changed. What they experienced out there, in those wet cathedral forests, where sunlight barely reaches the forest floor, challenges everything we understand about reality. Some things don't stay in the woods. Some things follow you home. These are 11 encounters that will make you question what's possible in the darkest corners of America's rainforests. I need you to understand something before I tell you this. I spent 12 years doing search and rescue in the Olympic Peninsula. 12 years pulling lost hikers out of ravines, tracking down confused elderly folks who wandered off trail, finding kids who thought they could handle the backcountry alone. I've seen hypothermia, broken bones, people half dead from dehydration. I've carried bodies out of those woods, real, explainable tragedies that made sense, even when they were horrible. What I'm about to tell you doesn't make sense. It's why I quit. It's why I can't look at moss anymore without feeling my skin try to crawl off my body. November 2019. We got a call about a missing graduate student from the University of Washington. Biology major, 24 years old, experienced hiker. Last seen heading toward the Hoh River Trail 3 days prior. Her car was still at the trailhead, tent found at a designated campsite, but no sign of her. The weather had been decent for November, cold but clear, so hypothermia wasn't our immediate concern. What worried us was how her stuff was arranged. Everything neat, organized, her sleeping bag folded like she'd planned to come back. Her boots were missing, so we knew she'd gone somewhere on foot. What we didn't know was why her journal was lying open on a flat rock about 20 yards from her tent, weighted down with stones like she wanted someone to find it. I didn't read it then. We had protocols. Document bag, keep searching. But I remember seeing the pages, how densely packed they were with writing, diagrams, sketches. The handwriting got messier toward the end. Like she'd been writing faster, more frantically. My partner radioed it in while I started walking a spiral pattern from her campsite, standard search grid. That's when I first noticed the moss. Now, you've got to understand. The Hoh rainforest is covered in moss. It's what makes it a rainforest. Every tree, every fallen log, every rock has this thick, green carpet growing on it. You stop noticing it after a while because it's literally everywhere. But that morning, I noticed. There was a patch on a big Sitka spruce about 30 feet from her tent that looked different. The moss had grown in these thick, dense clusters, and from the right angle, in the early light filtering through the canopy, it almost looked like a face. Not clearly, you understand. Just enough that your brain tried to make sense of the patterns and landed on something that resembled eyes, a mouth, the suggestion of a nose. I stared at it for maybe 10 seconds before telling myself I was being ridiculous and moving on. We searched all day, brought in 2 more teams, covered maybe 8 square miles of dense forest, called her name until our voices gave out, found nothing. As we were setting up to camp that night, we'd continue at first light. I walked back past that tree with the moss face. Except now it was on the other side of the trunk. Same pattern, same vague facial features, but it had somehow migrated around to the side, facing our search camp. I stood there staring at it, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Moss doesn't move. It grows slowly, over years, following moisture and light. It doesn't relocate in 8 hours. I didn't mention it to the team. I should have, but I didn't want to sound crazy. Instead, I lay in my tent that night, thinking about that journal, wondering what she'd been writing about. The next morning, I made an excuse to go back to the ranger station to file updated paperwork, and I read it. I wish I hadn't. Her entries started normal. Observations about fungal networks, sketches of mushroom species, notes about the interconnectedness of the forest ecosystem. She was studying how mycorrhizal fungi create communication networks between trees, something called the Wood Wide Web. Standard graduate student stuff. But around day 4, her entries changed. She started documenting the moss, how it seemed to respond to her presence. She'd noticed patterns forming in the moss growth around her regular observation sites, places she visited daily to check her sensor equipment. At first, she thought she was seeing things. Pattern recognition run amok. But she started taking photos, measurements. The moss was forming geometric patterns, perfect circles, spirals. And then, she wrote, it started forming faces. She documented 17 distinct face-like patterns in the moss within a quarter-mile radius of her research area. She photographed them, GPS tagged the locations. Then she did something that made my blood go cold when I read it. She cross-referenced her GPS coordinates with historical missing persons data from the Olympic National Forest. 16 of her 17 moss faces were growing at the exact spots where hikers had disappeared between 1974 and 1998. Some of those cases I knew about. Some I'd been too young to remember, but had heard the stories. But she'd found the locations, not the general areas where people were last seen, but the precise coordinates where, based on her research, she believed they'd actually vanished. The 17th face was at her campsite. It hadn't been there when she arrived. It appeared on her 3rd night on a tree at the edge of her tent's clearing. She'd measured it, photographed it. The pattern was still forming, she wrote. It wasn't complete yet. And here's what made me feel like my skull was trying to crack open. She wrote that it was starting to look like her. Her last entry was written in handwriting so shaky it was barely legible. She wrote that the faces weren't just patterns. They were responding. When she'd spoken out loud, trying to rationalize what she was seeing, the moss had moved. Not slowly, not the way plants grow, but deliberately, like something underneath it was shifting position. She'd watched moss reshape itself over the course of an hour, spiraling tighter, forming clearer features. Eyes that seemed to track her. A mouth that appeared to open. She wrote that she could hear something. Not with her ears, she clarified, but in her head. Like a whisper in a language she almost understood. The word she kept using was calling. The forest was calling something, and that something was using the faces to look back. Her final sentence was, I need to know where the 17th person is. I need to know if it's me. I radioed my team, told them to meet me at her original campsite. I needed to see that moss face she'd photographed. When we got there, I found her camera in her tent. We'd missed it the first sweep. It had been in her sleeping bag. I pulled up her photos. 17 faces, exactly as she'd described. The last one, the incomplete one at her campsite, was the worst thing I've ever seen. The moss had grown in these dense, almost hair-like clusters at the top, and the spacing of the eye-like patterns matched human proportions too closely to be coincidence. I could see what she meant about it looking like her. Then I looked at the tree where she'd taken the photo. The moss pattern had changed. It was complete now. The features were fully formed, eyes, nose, mouth, even the suggestion of bone structure underneath. And it did look like her, I had her driver's license photo from the missing persons report. I held it up. The resemblance was impossible but undeniable. One of the younger guys on my team pointed to another tree. Another moss face, this one crude, just starting to form. He made it into a joke. Said maybe the forest was getting ready to make him famous too. But I saw where he was standing when I looked at the GPS on my radio. He was standing at the exact coordinates where a hiker had vanished in October 2006. We found her 4 days later. Or rather, we found her body. She was 3 miles from her campsite, in an area we'd already searched twice, lying on her back in a small clearing. There was no obvious cause of death. No trauma, no signs of a struggle, no indication of exposure or medical emergency. She looked like she'd just lay down and stopped. The coroner ruled it cardiac arrest, stress-induced, brought on by unknown factors. But here's what they didn't put in the report because there's no box to check for it. She was covered in moss. Not just lying on moss, covered in it. It had grown over her clothes, her skin, into her hair. The coroner said it must have been there before she died. That she must have been lying there for days for that much growth to occur. But we'd searched that exact spot. She hadn't been there. And moss doesn't grow that fast. I went back once more, by myself, before I turned in my resignation. All 17 GPS coordinates. Every single one had a moss face now, complete, detailed, unmistakable faces. At the last location, where we'd found her body, the moss had grown into a perfect relief of her face, like a death mask made of living plant matter. Her eyes were open in it. Her mouth, too, like she was trying to speak. And at the edge of that clearing, on a tree I'd walked past a dozen times, there was a new face forming. Just starting. Just the vague suggestion of features. I took a photo of it with my phone, then pulled up the camera on selfie mode. I held them side by side. My stomach dropped. The moss was arranging itself to match my face, my eyes, my nose, the shape of my jaw. I haven't been back to Olympic National Forest since. That was 6 years ago. But I still check that spot on satellite imagery sometimes, when I can't sleep. The tree is still there, and the moss pattern is complete now. It looks exactly like me. Some nights, I swear I can feel it. Like being watched from 300 miles away. Like something in that forest is keeping track of me, waiting to see if I'll come back. 17 faces became 18 when she disappeared. Now I think it's waiting to make 19. I don't know what the moss is, or what's underneath it, or why it takes faces and keeps them. I just know that the forest is collecting us, one at a time, and turning us into something that doesn't die. Something that just watches, waiting in the wet green darkness for the next person to notice, to measure, to try to understand. And once you see it, once you really see it, it sees you back. That's when it starts making your face. That's when it starts calling. My grandfather told me things before he died that I wasn't supposed to share with outsiders. Our family has always walked a line between the old ways and the new world, between what the tribe knows and what gets written down in official records. He was Quinault elder, a keeper of stories, and he carried knowledge that made him careful about where he walked in the forest and when. I'm telling you this now because I think the agreement is breaking down. I think whatever my grandfather's generation promised is coming undone, and I need someone to know the truth before it's too late. Before September comes around again and more people disappear into the old growth and nobody asks why. The Quinault Reservation borders the Olympic National Forest. Has for over a century, since the government drew lines on maps and told us which parts of our ancestral land we could keep. But there are older borders, boundaries that existed long before any white surveyor set foot here. And those boundaries aren't marked on any map you'll find in a ranger station. My grandfather showed me once, when I was 17. We walked deep into the Colonel Bob Wilderness area, to a place where the trees are so thick the forest floor stays in permanent twilight even at noon. He pointed to certain trees, massive Sitka spruces and western red cedars, some of them 40 feet around at the base, older than memory. He said those trees marked the edge of something, a territory that belonged to what he called the September Walkers. I didn't understand then. I asked him what that meant, and he just shook his head. Said I'd learn when I needed to learn, and not before. But he made me promise something that day. He made me swear that I would never, under any circumstances, go into the deep forest during September. Particularly not during the third week of September. Particularly not between the hours of dusk and dawn. I asked him why, and he said, because that's when they walk. That's when the agreement gets honored. And if you're there when it happens, you become part of it. I kept that promise for years without understanding it. But after he died in 2019, I found his journals. He'd kept meticulous records, written in a mix of English and Quinault, hidden in a locked box in his woodshop. There were dozens of notebooks spanning 50 years, and they told a story I wished I didn't know. They told me about the September Agreement, about what happened in 1954, and about why certain people in our community go missing on a schedule so predictable you could set your watch by it. In September of 1954, there was a logging operation in what's now part of the Olympic National Forest. This was before the expansion of protected land, when timber companies were cutting everything they could reach. There was a camp set up about 15 miles from Lake Quinault. Maybe 200 men working the operation. According to my grandfather's journals, the loggers had pushed into an area that the tribe had warned them about. There were old stories about those particular groves, about things that lived in the oldest parts of the forest, about why certain stands of trees were never cut, even when our people needed cedar for canoes or redwood for houses. But the logging company didn't care about tribal warnings. They cared about board feet and profit margins. The camp disappeared over the course of 3 nights in mid-September. Not abandoned, disappeared. 200 men, their equipment, their trucks, everything. The first night, 70 men vanished. The remaining workers radioed for help, said something was walking through the camp after dark, said the forest was moving, said trees were in different places than they'd been at sunset. The second night, another 60 men. By the third night, the few who were left had barricaded themselves in the main building, and they radioed one final transmission before the line went dead. My grandfather had a transcript of that transmission in his journal. The last thing they said was, "They're not human. They're shaped like us, but they're not human. They're made of the forest. They want the agreement honored." When the authorities finally reached the camp a week later, they found it empty. No bodies, no blood, no signs of struggle. Just empty buildings and equipment sitting silent in the forest. The official report called it a mass desertion, said the men must have abandoned the operation for reasons unknown. But my grandfather wrote that the tribal elders knew different. They knew the forest had taken payment for the violation, and they knew it would want more. That's when the agreement was made. My grandfather was young then, but he was present when the tribal leadership met with whatever came out of those deep groves. He didn't write much about that meeting, but what he did write made my hands shake when I read it. He said the things that came out of the forest looked human from a distance. They wore shapes that resembled men and women, dressed in clothes from different eras, some in modern work clothes, some in outfits from decades past, some in things so old he couldn't identify the style. But when you got close, you could see they weren't people. Their skin had the texture of bark. Their eyes reflected light like an animal's. They moved in ways that weren't quite right, like they were mimicking human movement without fully understanding the mechanics of joints and muscles. They spoke, though. That's what terrified him most. They spoke in perfect English, in Quinault, in languages he didn't recognize. And they made their terms clear. The forest would allow human presence. It would tolerate the roads, the hiking trails, the campsites. But every 7 years, in the 3rd week of September, it would take what it was owed. 3 people. No more, no less. 3 people who ventured into the deep forest during that week, would walk with them, would join them, would become part of whatever they were. The tribe could try to warn people away, could try to reduce the chances, but they couldn't prevent it entirely. The forest would take its 3, one way or another. And as long as the agreement was honored, the larger community would be left alone. My grandfather's journals documented every 7-year cycle since 1954. September 1961. 3 hikers vanished from the Colonel Bob Trail. September 1968. 2 campers and a park ranger disappeared near the Quinault River. September 1975. 3 hunters never returned from the backcountry. The pattern continued, meticulous and unchanging. Every 7 years, always 3 people, always during that specific week in September. And here's what made me sick when I realized it. I'd heard about most of these disappearances. They were local legends, unsolved missing persons cases, the kind of stories that get told around campfires. But nobody had ever connected them. Nobody had ever mapped the pattern except my grandfather, because nobody else knew to look for it. The journals also documented something else. Sightings of the September walkers outside of their designated week. My grandfather and others had seen them over the years, always at a distance, always in the deepest parts of the forest. They moved through the woods in small groups, silent and purposeful, heading toward some destination that made sense only to them. And every 7 years, their numbers grew by 3. I didn't want to believe it. I told myself my grandfather had been old, maybe confused, maybe mixing up tribal stories with real events. But then September 2021 came around. 7 years since the last cycle in 2014, when 3 backpackers had disappeared from the Enchanted Valley Trail. I decided I needed to know. I needed to see if the September walkers were real or just a story that had consumed too much of my family's fear. I broke my promise. I went into the forest during the 3rd week of September. I picked a vantage point on a ridge overlooking one of the deep valleys my grandfather had marked in his journals, and I waited. I brought camping gear, binoculars, a camera. I told myself I'd stay distant. Just observe. Just prove to myself one way or another whether any of this was real. I saw them on the 2nd night. They came at dusk, emerging from the old growth like they'd been standing among the trees all along, and simply decided to become visible. I counted 27 of them. They moved in single file through the valley below, following no trail I could identify, walking with that wrong gait my grandfather had described. Too smooth, no wasted movement, like watching animatronics programmed by someone who'd studied human walking but never quite captured it. They were dressed in different clothes, different eras. I could make out jeans and flannel, older wool coats, things that might have been from the 1970s or 80s. One of them was wearing a park ranger uniform. They walked for maybe 20 minutes before disappearing back into the forest. I had my camera up, taking photos, my hands shaking so badly I knew most of them would be blurred. But I got some clear shots. When I reviewed them later, I understood why people don't talk about this. In the photos, the figures had faces. I could make out features. And I could see what my grandfather meant about the bark-like texture, about the eyes that caught light wrong. They looked human enough to trigger recognition, but wrong enough to trigger every instinct that says, predator, danger, not one of us. 3 days later, the news reported 3 missing hikers. A couple and a solo hiker, all vanished from different areas of Olympic National Forest during the same 48-hour period. All 3 had been experienced backcountry travelers. None of them were ever found. I matched their missing persons photos against my camera footage. I can't be completely certain because of the distance and the image quality, but I think I saw them. I think they were walking with the others that night, before anyone reported them missing. I think the forest had already chosen them, and they'd already become September walkers, and they just didn't know it yet. My grandfather's journals have one more detail that keeps me up at night. He wrote that the agreement was made under duress, that the tribal elders who negotiated it did so to prevent something worse. He wrote that the September walkers were once human, were still partly human, were trapped in some state between the living world and something else. And he wrote that they were the compromise. The forest wanted more. The forest wanted everyone who violated its deep places. The agreement limited the damage, gave the forest a structured payment it would accept. But he also wrote that agreements can be broken from either side. If humans pushed too far, cleared too much, disrespected the boundaries too flagrantly, the forest would take back what it gave up in 1954. It would take everything. I don't know what happens when the forest decides the agreement is void. I don't want to find out. But September 2028 is coming, the next cycle. The forest will want its 3, just like it has every 7 years since my grandfather was young. And I've started hearing stories about new development planned on the Olympic Peninsula, about pressure to open up more old growth areas for recreation, about boundaries being pushed. I wonder if the forest is paying attention. I wonder if it's counting. I wonder if 3 will be enough this time, or if the September walkers will come for more. Because I've seen them now. I know they're real. And I know that once you walk with them, you don't come back. You just keep walking, through the endless twilight under the ancient trees, waiting for September to come around again so you can be part of the collection, part of the payment, part of the forest's memory of every debt that's ever gone unpaid. I work in acoustic ecology. Worked. Past tense, I guess, because I can't do it anymore. My job was to record natural soundscapes, the ambient audio of ecosystems before human noise pollution drowns them out. I've recorded pristine environments all over the world. Deserts, Arctic tundra, deep ocean trenches using hydrophones. I thought I understood sound. I thought I understood how audio works, how it moves through space, how it gets captured and stored. I was wrong. Sound doesn't just travel forward through time. Sometimes it echoes backward. And when you record those echoes, when you capture them and play them back, you hear things that haven't happened yet. Things that you're going to do. Things that you're going to say. Your own voice, speaking words you haven't thought of yet. Making decisions you haven't made. And once you've heard yourself in the future, You can't unhear it. You can't change it. You can only watch yourself walk toward it like a recording playing out exactly as captured. This started in October 2022. I was conducting a long-term study in the Quinault Rainforest section of Olympic National Forest. The goal was to document the acoustic properties of old-growth forests. How sound behaves differently in those ancient, moss-covered environments compared to second-growth or managed forests. I set up recording stations at specific intervals throughout a 5-square-mile area, each one equipped with high-sensitivity microphones capable of capturing frequencies above and below human hearing range. The equipment ran continuously, 24 hours a day, creating a detailed audio map of the forest over time. The first 3 weeks were exactly what I expected. I recorded rain dripping from moss, wind moving through the canopy, the calls of varied thrushes and winter wrens, the occasional elk bugling in the distance. I'd sit in my camp at night with my headphones on, listening to the day's recordings at different speeds, isolating specific frequencies, documenting patterns. It was exactly the kind of pristine data I needed. Then on day 23, I noticed something in the overnight recording from Station 7, positioned about a mile northeast of my camp, near a particularly dense grove of Sitka spruce. There was a voice. Human voice. Male. Speaking clearly despite being maybe 100 yards from the microphone based on the audio signature. At first, I thought it was another hiker, someone passing through after dark, even though that section of forest wasn't near any marked trails. I isolated the frequency, cleaned up the background noise, and listened again. The voice was saying coordinates, GPS coordinates, latitude and longitude, spoken in that precise military format. 47.9389 north, 123.8521 west. I pulled up my mapping software and plotted the coordinates. They pointed to a location about 2 miles south of Station 7, in an area I hadn't planned to hike to yet. I marked it for future investigation and moved on with my work. The next night, Station 7 picked up the voice again. Same voice, same precision, but different coordinates. These ones pointed to a spot even farther south, near the Colonel Bob Wilderness boundary. The third night, it happened again. New coordinates. I plotted this one too, and that's when my stomach dropped. The third set of coordinates pointed to exactly where I was planning to hike the following day to check on Station 12. I hadn't told anyone my hiking plans. I hadn't written them down. I'd only decided that morning which station to check next based on battery levels and data storage capacity. But the voice on the recording from the night before had given me the exact coordinates of where I would decide to go. I sat in my tent staring at my GPS unit, at the plotted point that matched the recording, trying to rationalize what I was hearing. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe someone else was doing survey work in the area and happened to mention those coordinates. Except nobody else was authorized to be conducting research in that section of forest. I checked. It was just me. I did something then that I regret. I recorded myself. I set up my primary recorder next to my camp chair and just started talking. I said, "This is October 19th, 2022. It's 3:47 p.m. I'm sitting at my base camp. Tomorrow I'm planning to hike to Station 12. Then I gave the coordinates out loud, the exact same ones the voice had spoken the night before. I played back the recording. My voice was identical to the voice on Station 7's recording. Same cadence, same tone, same precise articulation of the numbers. But Station 7 had captured it 18 hours before I spoke those words. It had recorded my future voice. I should have left then. Packed up my equipment, hiked out, reported equipment malfunction or personal emergency. But I'm a scientist, I needed to understand. I needed to collect more data. So I modified my experiment. Instead of checking Station 12 like I'd planned, I deliberately changed my route. I hiked west to Station 4 instead. I documented the decision. I recorded myself saying out loud, "I'm changing plans. I'm going to Station 4 instead. I'm not going to Station 12. I felt like I was proving something, taking control back. That night, I listened to Station 7's recording. The voice was there again, my voice, and it said, "This isn't working. Changing routes doesn't matter. I already went to Station 12. I'm going to keep going to Station 12 no matter how many times I try to change it." I hadn't said those words. I hadn't thought them. But they were in my voice, recorded hours before I would even know they existed. I'm not explaining this well. Let me try again. The recordings were capturing my voice from the future. But not from my subjective future, from the actual future. From a timeline where I'd already made choices, already spoken words, already walked paths. And those recordings were now evidence that whatever I decided to do, I'd already done it. Free will was just me catching up to a version of myself that had already moved forward. I tested it obsessively. Every night, I'd listen to Station 7's recording. Every night, my future voice would tell me what I was going to do the next day. And every day, no matter how hard I tried to do something different, I would end up doing exactly what the voice had described. It wasn't that I was being controlled. It's worse than that. I made all my choices freely. I just discovered that my choices had already been made by a version of me that existed ahead in time. And that version was somehow leaking backward into my recording equipment. The breaking point came on day 31. I listened to that night's recording from Station 7, and I heard myself screaming. Not words, just raw, animal terror. The sound was so distorted by fear that I barely recognized my own voice, but the frequency analysis matched perfectly. It was definitely me. And based on the audio signature, I was standing right next to the microphone when I made that sound. The timestamp on the recording said it would happen at 2:37 a.m., 3 nights from then. I had 3 days to figure out how to not go to Station 7 at 2:37 a.m. 3 days to change whatever future had already been recorded. I tried everything. I broke down Station 7 and moved it to a completely different location. I recorded myself stating clearly that I would not, under any circumstances, hike to that area during the night. I even considered hiking out entirely, abandoning the project. But some part of me knew it wouldn't matter. The scream was already on the recording. It had already happened in some forward version of time. I was just waiting to catch up to it. On the night of day 34, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my tent listening to every sound in the forest, trying to convince myself I could control what happened next. At 1:58 a.m., I heard something outside. Footsteps. Not animal footsteps, human. Slow, deliberate, circling my camp. I grabbed my flashlight and recorder. I never stopped recording, even then, and called out, "Who's there?" The footsteps stopped. Then I heard my own voice answer me from outside the tent. Not from the future. From right outside. It said, "You need to come to Station 7. You need to hear what comes next." I don't remember making the decision to follow. I just remember hiking through the darkness, my flashlight cutting through the mist between the trees, following the sound of my own voice calling directions from ahead of me. "Turn left here. Careful of that log. Keep going north. It took me exactly 39 minutes to reach where I'd originally set up Station 7, even though I'd moved the equipment 3 days earlier. The microphone was there, exactly where I'd first mounted it, like I'd never relocated it at all. I checked my GPS, 2:37 a.m., the exact timestamp from the recording. And that's when I heard it. Not from the forest, from the microphone itself. The playback speaker had activated on its own, and it was playing sound. But not the scream. Something else. A recording I'd never captured, never heard before. It was my voice, speaking calmly, precisely, and it was describing everything that had happened to me over the past 34 days. Every decision, every test, every attempt to change my route. It was describing it all as if reading from a script, as if my entire experience had been something pre-recorded that I was simply performing. Then the recording jumped forward. It started describing things that hadn't happened yet. It described me hiking back to my camp at 4:15 a.m. It described me packing my equipment at dawn. It described me stopping at the ranger station on my way out and telling them I'd completed my study early due to equipment failure. It described me driving home, filing my final report with fake data, never telling anyone what I'd really found. It described the next 7 years of my life in perfect detail. Career moves, relationships, the city I'd moved to, the job I'd quit, the person I'd meet in 2026. All of it in my voice, recorded with perfect clarity, describing a future I hadn't lived yet. The recording ended with one final sentence. My voice said, "And in November 2029, you'll come back here. You'll bring better equipment. You'll try to capture the source. And that's when you'll find out what's making the recordings." I did scream then. That's what the earlier recording had captured. Not fear of something in the forest. Fear of hearing my entire future played back to me like a documentary about someone else's life. Fear of knowing that everything I was going to do, I'd already done in some version of time that my equipment could access, but I couldn't change. I hiked out the next morning. I filed my report. I quit my job 6 months later, exactly as the recording had described. And now it's November 2020. I've got new recording equipment in my truck. Better microphones, higher frequency range, equipment sensitive enough to capture sounds in dimensions I couldn't access before. And tomorrow, I'm driving back to Quinault. Because the recording said I would. Because I need to know what's making these sounds. What's reaching back through time and capturing futures that haven't happened yet. Or maybe that have always been happening, and we're just too locked into linear time to notice. I don't think I'm going to like what I find. The recording of my future had a strange quality after the part about me coming back. The audio got distorted, like it was being played through water or through some medium that isn't air. And underneath my voice describing my return, there was another sound. Something breathing. Something that exists in the space where future sound loops back into the past. Something that's been listening to all of us this entire time, recording everything we're going to say and do. Keeping a library of human futures in the frequencies between heartbeats. I'm leaving this recording here in case I don't come back from Quinault. In case whatever I find there doesn't want me to leave again. Just know that if you ever work with audio recording equipment in isolated environments, and you hear your own voice saying things you haven't said yet, don't try to fight it. Don't try to change what the recording says you'll do. You can't rewrite what's already been captured. You can only play it back and hope the thing that's recording you stays on its side of time. I used to lead wilderness therapy groups for troubled teenagers. The concept is simple. Take kids who are struggling with trauma, addiction, behavioral issues, whatever's got them stuck, and put them in nature for extended periods. Teach them survival skills, self-reliance. Give them space away from the chaos of their regular lives. I believed in it completely. Believed that the forest could heal people if you gave it the chance. I don't believe that anymore. Because I've learned that the forest doesn't heal. It just reveals. It shows you what's been waiting underneath everything you think you know about the world. And sometimes, what it shows you can't be unseen. Sometimes the forest demands more than you're willing to give, and it doesn't care whether you're ready or not. This happened in October 2021. I was leading a group of 6 teenagers, ages 15 to 17, all court-mandated to complete the program, on a 3-day trek through the Olympic National Forest near the Sol Duc Falls area. We'd done 2 days without incident. Good weather, good group dynamics. Kids were actually engaging with the experience instead of just counting down hours. On the 3rd day, we were hiking back toward our pickup point when the weather turned. And I mean turned fast. 1 minute we had partial sun breaking through the canopy. The next minute the sky went dark and we had wind tearing through the trees and rain coming down so hard you couldn't see 10 feet ahead. We needed shelter immediately. This wasn't the kind of storm you wait out under a tarp. This was the kind that drops branches, floods trails, creates hypothermia conditions in minutes. I scanned our surroundings, trying to remember if there were any established shelters or structures nearby. Nothing. We were in deep old growth, miles from the nearest ranger station. Then one of the kids, Marcus, 16, quiet kid who barely talked, pointed ahead and said, "There, that tree?" I looked where he was pointing and saw it. A massive western red cedar, had to be 15 feet in diameter at the base, and it was hollow. The opening faced away from the wind, a natural entrance maybe 4 feet tall. Perfect emergency shelter. We pushed through the underbrush and scrambled inside, all 7 of us fitting into the hollow interior with room to spare. The tree was ancient, the inside space maybe 10 feet across, the walls thick with that distinctive cedar smell. It was dry. It was protected. It was exactly what we needed. We settled in. Kids catching their breath, wringing out wet clothes, pulling emergency blankets from their packs. The storm raged outside, but inside the cedar, we were safe. That's what I thought anyway. That's what I kept telling myself even after I noticed the carvings. They were on the interior wall of the tree, scratched into the wood at different heights. Names, dates, messages. I pulled out my flashlight and examined them more closely. Robert Chen, May 1997, still waiting. Sarah M., June 2003, don't go deeper. JK, September 2015, it knows we're here. There were dozens of them, going back decades based on the weathering of the cuts. Every single one mentioned waiting. Every single one had a tone of fear barely contained by the brevity of carved words. I should have taken the kids and left immediately, storm or no storm. But I was trying to rationalize it. People had used this shelter before. People had been scared because storms are scary. The messages were just fear-talking, people leaving their mark out of boredom or anxiety. Except none of the names said "made it out" or "storm passed" or anything that suggested relief. They all suggested something was still happening, something ongoing. Marcus was the first one to notice the smell. He said, "You guys smell that?" We all stopped talking. Underneath the cedar smell, there was something else. Something organic and wrong, like rot, but sweeter. Like something had died in the tree and been there long enough to move past the stage of decay into whatever comes after. One of the girls, Ashley, said her grandfather had been a mortician, and the smell reminded her of the funeral home basement. Nobody wanted to discuss what that might mean. Then the rain stopped. Not gradually, just stopped. Like someone had shut off a faucet, the wind cut out at the same instant. The forest went completely silent. That kind of silence that feels unnatural, like the absence of sound is itself a presence. I looked out through the opening of the cedar and saw only mist. Thick, gray mist that hadn't been there before, pressing against the entrance like it was trying to get in. I checked my watch. 4:47 p.m. We'd been in the shelter for maybe 20 minutes. I told the kids we'd wait another 10 minutes to make sure the storm was really done. Then we'd move out. Get back to the trail, get to the pickup point, get the hell out of the woods. But when I looked at my GPS unit, it wasn't working. No signal, which was normal in the deep forest, but it wasn't even tracking our position anymore. The screen showed our location as coordinates that didn't make sense. Numbers that put us somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. That's when we heard the voices. They came from deeper in the tree, from the back of the hollow space where the interior narrowed into darkness. Whispering at first, then gradually louder. Multiple voices overlapping, all saying the same thing. Stay in the tree. Don't leave the tree, it's waiting outside. The kids heard it too. I watched their faces go pale, watched them instinctively press against the walls away from the dark interior. I aimed my flashlight toward the back of the hollow. The beam only penetrated maybe 6 feet before the darkness seemed to swallow it. But I could see that the interior went back farther than should be physically possible. The tree was 15 feet in diameter, which meant the hollow should have been maybe 10 feet deep at most. My light was showing a passage that extended at least 20 feet, sloping downward, the walls getting narrower. And there were things on those walls, not carvings. Scratch marks, deep gouges in the wood like something with claws had been trying to dig its way out, or dig its way in. Marcus stood up. His eyes were fixed on the darkness at the back of the tree, and he said, in a voice that didn't sound like his, "They're still here. All of them. Everyone who waited. They're down in the roots." I grabbed his arm, pulled him back, told him to sit down. But he kept staring into that darkness, and he said, "It doesn't let them leave. It keeps them. It grows around them." One of the other kids started crying. Quiet, controlled crying, like she was trying not to be heard. She said, "My phone is getting messages." I told her that was impossible. We were miles from cell service. But she showed me her screen. Text messages were coming in, dozens of them, all from contacts labeled unknown. The messages were all variations of the same thing. Don't leave yet. It's still outside. You have to wait longer. The tree keeps you safe. I watched 3 new messages arrive while I was looking at the screen. The timestamps showed they were being sent from inside our location, from inside the tree. I made the decision then. We were leaving. Storm or no storm, voices or no voices, we were getting out of that cedar and back onto the trail. I told the kids to pack up, get ready to move. Most of them obeyed immediately, grateful for any action that meant leaving. But Marcus didn't move. He was still staring at the darkness, and he said, "You don't understand. The tree isn't shelter. It's a trap. Everyone who's ever used it is still here. They went deeper to escape the storm, and they couldn't find their way back out." I looked at the carvings again. All those names, all those dates. I pulled out my phone and searched for Robert Chen missing 1997 Olympic National Forest. I had just enough battery. The search came back with a result. Robert Chen age 32, disappeared during a day hike in May 1997, never found. I searched for Sarah M., missing 2003 Olympic. Sarah Morrison, age 28, vanished during a camping trip in June 2003. Body never recovered. I didn't need to search the rest. I knew what I'd find. The voices from the back of the tree got louder. They weren't whispering anymore. They were pleading. Don't leave. It's out there. It's waiting for you. It always waits. And underneath the voices, I could hear something else. Movement. Like something large shifting position in the narrow space at the back of the hollow. Like roots moving. Like the tree itself was breathing. I grabbed Marcus and physically pulled him toward the entrance. The other kids were already there, pressed against each other, staring out into the mist. I looked out with them and understood why they were hesitating. The mist had shapes in it. Human shapes, barely visible, standing in a circle around the tree. Tall figures, perfectly still, watching the entrance. Waiting. I counted them. 17 figures. 17 people standing motionless in the fog. Forming a perimeter we'd have to cross to get away from the cedar. I thought about all the carved names. I thought about what Marcus had said about the tree-keeping people. And I realized the choice wasn't between staying and leaving. The choice was between being inside the tree or being outside with whatever had been collecting everyone who tried to leave. We ran. I'm not proud of it. But we ran. I shouted for the kids to stay together, and we crashed through the perimeter of figures. They didn't move as we passed. They just watched. Their faces were wrong. Too gray, too still, mouths slightly open like they were trying to speak, but had forgotten how. One of them reached out as we passed, not to grab, just to touch. Their fingers brushed my jacket, and they felt wrong. Cold and hard like bark. We made it back to the trail. We made it to the pickup point. We made it home, all 7 of us. But here's the thing that keeps me awake at night. When I filed my report about emergency shelter usage, I included the GPS coordinates of that cedar tree. The ranger station sent someone to investigate. They found the tree. They found the hollow interior. But they said there were no carvings. The walls were smooth, no names, no dates, no messages. And the hollow space was exactly the depth it should be for a tree that size, maybe 8 feet deep. No passages, no darkness extending into impossible space, no scratch marks. They said I must have been mistaken about which tree we'd sheltered in. Storm stress, they said. Easy to get disoriented. But I know which tree it was. And I know what I saw carved on those walls. I know what I heard in the darkness. And here's what really keeps me up at night. 3 weeks after we got back, Marcus called me. He said he'd been having dreams about the tree. He said in the dreams he could see all the people who were still inside, the ones who went deeper into the passage and got lost in the root system. He said they're not dead. They're waiting. They're part of the tree now, woven into the wood and the roots. And they can feel when someone new takes shelter. They can feel the tree growing around new people, adding them to whatever collection it's been building for decades. I looked up the history of that section of forest. 43 people have disappeared in a 5-mile radius of those coordinates since 1953. 43 people who were never found, never explained, just gone. And I think about those figures standing in the mist, watching us leave. I think about how they didn't try to stop us. I think maybe they were just counting, making sure the right number came out, making sure the tree got to keep whoever it wanted. I quit leading wilderness therapy after that. I tell people it's because of burnout, because the work got too heavy. But the truth is, I can't go back into old-growth forest anymore. I can't look at hollow trees without wondering what's really inside them, how deep they actually go, and whether the people who never came back are still waiting in the darkness, hoping someone will be stupid enough to go deeper and find them. My husband died on a Tuesday. I remember because we were supposed to have dinner with friends that Thursday, and I had to call them and cancel. "There's been an accident," I said. Like it was something that had just happened to us randomly, not something that took him away permanently. Park ranger, 23 years on the job, died doing what he loved, everyone said at the funeral. A rock slide near Lake Quinault. They recovered his body. We had a casket, a burial, closure. That's what everyone told me I should be grateful for. Closure, as if knowing exactly how your husband died makes it easier somehow. As if seeing his ranger uniform folded at the funeral makes the empty house feel less empty. His name was David. David Strickland, Olympic National Forest Ranger. Station 7 near Lake Quinault. 46 years old when he died. We'd been married for 19 years. I knew everything about him. His coffee order, the way he hummed when he was doing paperwork, how he always kissed me goodbye before dawn patrols, even when I was still asleep. I knew him completely, or I thought I did. Until 6 months after his funeral when I got the first email from his work account. It came through on a Sunday morning. I was sitting at the kitchen table with my laptop, paying bills, trying to figure out how to manage everything on one income now. The notification popped up. New message from D. Strickland, 8 NPS Gov. His ranger station email. I stared at it for a full minute before I could bring myself to click. I thought maybe it was an automated system message. Some bureaucratic loose end that hadn't been cleaned up. The Park Service isn't great about deactivating accounts when people die. But when I opened it, it wasn't automated. It was personal. The subject line said, "Patrol Report, Sector 7F." The message was brief, written in David's style, efficient, detail-oriented, the way he always wrote his reports. It said, "Completed patrol of Sector 7F. Trail conditions nominal. Encountered 2 hikers near marker 14. Advised about weather conditions. No incidents to report. We'll continue monitoring the northwest quadrant tomorrow. DS." I checked the timestamp. The email had been sent at 6:47 a.m. that morning, 6 months after David died, from his work computer at the ranger station. I called the station immediately. The ranger who answered said nobody had been in that morning. The station didn't open until 9 on Sundays. And David's office had been cleaned out months ago, his computer decommissioned, his access credentials deleted from the system. There was no way anyone could send email from his account. I told myself it was a glitch, a delayed message from before he died, finally making its way through some server error. I archived it and tried to forget about it. Then 2 weeks later, another email arrived. Same sender, same format. Patrol Report, Sector 9A. This one described a patrol route David had never worked. Sector 9A was in a part of the forest he'd never been assigned to, an area that wasn't even in his district. The report mentioned trail markers that didn't exist according to current park maps. It mentioned a ranger station designation, Station 12, that I couldn't find any record of. I started researching. I pulled up old maps of Olympic National Forest, contacted retired rangers, dug through historical archives. I found references to a Station 12 in documents from the 1970s, but it had been decommissioned in 1981. The area had been reclassified, the trails renumbered. David couldn't have been patrolling there because there was no "there" anymore. Not in the version of the forest that existed in 2018. The emails kept coming, once every 2 weeks, like clockwork. Always patrol reports, always describing routes David was supposedly walking, hikers he was supposedly encountering, weather conditions he was supposedly observing. I read every one obsessively. I compared them to his old reports from when he was alive, checking the writing style, the phrasing, the details. It was him. The way he abbreviated Northwest as NW. The way he always noted temperature and cloud cover even when it wasn't required. The way he ended every report with just his initials. It was David's voice coming through those emails as clearly as if he'd been sitting next to me dictating them. But the places he was describing didn't match reality. The trail markers were wrong. The sector designations were from different decades. In one email, he mentioned encountering a family of 4 near the old fire tower on Ridge 47. I looked it up. There had been a fire tower there, but it had burned down in 1993. Another email mentioned meeting Ranger Patterson during a joint patrol. I found a Ranger Patterson in the archives, Gerald Patterson, who'd worked Olympic National Forest from 1962 to 1987. He'd been dead for 15 years. I started mapping the locations David mentioned in his emails. I plotted every trail marker, every landmark, every geographical reference. What I discovered made my hands shake. He was describing a version of Olympic National Forest that existed in fragments across different time periods. The trail system from the 1970s, overlaid with ranger stations from the 1960s, combined with natural landmarks that had been destroyed or changed by fires, floods, and development over the decades. He was patrolling a forest that wasn't quite the forest that existed now, but also wasn't quite any forest that had ever existed in any single time period. It was like he was walking through a palimpsest, a layered version of the landscape where different eras bled into each other. Then the emails changed. 6 months after they started, I received one that was different from the others. The subject line was still Patrol Report, but the message said, "Encountered unusual phenomenon on Ridge 22. Ranger station visible from summit, but station appears abandoned. Maps show location as decommissioned since 1981, but structure is intact and operational. Observed multiple rangers entering and exiting building. None responded to radio contact. We'll investigate further tomorrow." Ridge 22, Station 12. The decommissioned station I'd found references to. I looked up the coordinates David had included in the email. The next day, I drove to Olympic National Forest. I hiked to the coordinates. It took me 4 hours of difficult terrain, following trails that were barely maintained, pushing through underbrush that looked like it hadn't been disturbed in years. When I reached the coordinates, there was nothing there. No station, no building, no foundation, just forest. But there was something. A clearing that was too regular to be natural. Trees that formed a perimeter that looked planned. And in the center, a flat area where the vegetation was different, thinner, newer, like something had been there once, and the forest was still in the process of reclaiming it. I stood in that clearing, and I felt something. It's hard to describe. Like the air was thicker, heavier. Like the space occupied a different density than the forest around it. I took photos. I recorded video. I documented everything. When I got home and reviewed the footage, I saw something I hadn't seen with my naked eye. In 3 of the photos, there was a structure. Translucent, barely visible, like a double exposure. A building that looked like a ranger station, wooden construction, pitched roof, windows that caught light that wasn't there. It was only visible in the photos, only when the light hit at certain angles. But it was there. The emails continued. David kept sending patrol reports from his impossible forest. He kept describing encounters with rangers who didn't exist anymore. Hiking trails that had been closed for decades, weather patterns that didn't match current records. And I kept reading them, kept mapping them, kept trying to understand where he was and how he was still sending these messages. Then last month, I got an email that wasn't a patrol report. The subject line was just my name, Sarah. The message said, "I don't know if you're getting these. I don't know if they're reaching you. But if they are, I need you to understand something. I'm still here. I'm still doing my job. The forest is different here, but it's still the forest. I see other rangers. We patrol together sometimes. Some of them have been here longer than I have. Some of them don't remember when they arrived. Time works differently here. Days blend together. But I remember you. I remember our house, our life. I just can't figure out how to get back to it. I'm trying. I'm walking every trail, checking every map, looking for the boundary between where I am and where you are. But the forest keeps extending. Every time I think I've reached the edge, there's more trail, more territory, more forest to patrol. I don't think I'm dead, Sarah. I think I'm somewhere else. Somewhere the forest goes that maps don't show. And I think I've been here much longer than 6 months. The other rangers, some of them have photos, and the photos are old, decades old. But they remember taking them recently. Time is different here. I don't know how long it's been for you. I don't know if you're still in our house or if years have passed. But I'm still here, and I'm still looking for the way home. I've read that email 1,000 times. I've analyzed every word, and I've made a decision. I'm going back to Ridge 22. I'm going back to those coordinates where the station doesn't exist, but somehow does in photographs. Because if David is stuck somewhere the forest hides, somewhere between versions of time where dead rangers still walk their patrols, then maybe there's a way in. Maybe there's a boundary I can cross if I know where to look. I've been receiving more emails. They're coming more frequently now. Every few days instead of every 2 weeks. The most recent one arrived this morning. David said he saw the station again. He said this time he went inside. He said there were records there, logs going back to 1952, all written in different hands, all documenting patrols through forests that don't quite match reality. He said one of the logs was his. David Strickland, assigned to Station 12, continuous patrol since 2018. But the log showed entries spanning 7 years. 7 years of patrols, 7 years of reports, all compressed into the 6 months since his death. He said he found something else too. A map on the wall of the station, hand-drawn, showing trails that connect different versions of the forest across different times. And one of the trails leads to a marker labeled Boundary Outside. He said he's going to follow it. He said if he can find that boundary, maybe he can cross it. Maybe he can come home. I don't know if any of this is real. I don't know if I'm reading emails from my dead husband or if grief has broken something in my brain and I'm hallucinating meaning from automated server errors. But I know I'm going back to those coordinates. I know I'm going to that clearing where the station exists in photographs, but not in reality. And I know I'm going to wait there until either David comes back or I figure out how to follow him into whatever version of the forest has been collecting rangers for decades. His last email ended with this. I can see the boundary now. It looks like a trail marker, but it's made of something that isn't wood. It's made of something that looks like forest, but isn't forest. I'm going to touch it tomorrow. If I don't send another email after that, It means I either made it back to you or I got lost somewhere even deeper. Either way, I love you. I've loved you through every version of time I've walked through here. And if the forest has been keeping me, at least it let me keep that. That was 3 days ago. I haven't received another email since. Tomorrow morning, I'm hiking to Ridge 22. I'm bringing camping equipment, enough supplies for a week. I'm bringing printouts of all his emails, all the maps I've made, all the evidence I've collected. And I'm bringing his wedding ring, the one they gave me after the funeral. Because if there's a boundary between the forest he's walking and the forest I know, maybe something that belonged to both of us can help me cross it. Maybe love is a frequency that works in dimensions that maps don't show. Maybe that's what the emails have been all along, not messages from a dead man, but a signal from someone who's just walking trails that exist in spaces between moments, waiting for someone to notice and follow. I'll let you know what I find. If I find anything. If I come back. I study fungi. Not the kind you find in grocery stores or the kind that grows on old bread. I study mycorrhizal networks, the vast underground web of fungal filaments that connects trees and forests, allowing them to share nutrients, water, and according to recent research, possibly information. It's called the Wood Wide Web, and it's one of the most fascinating biological systems on the planet. Or it was fascinating before I understood what it actually does. Before I realized that when we talk about forests communicating, we're not using a metaphor. We're describing something that's been watching us, studying us, learning our patterns with an intelligence we're not equipped to comprehend. I was conducting fieldwork in the Hoh Rainforest section of Olympic National Forest in the fall of 2023. The project was straightforward: map the mycelium network distribution across a 5-square-kilometer area, document the connections between Douglas fir and Sitka spruce populations, measure nutrient transfer rates. Standard ecological research. I'd been working in that forest for 6 weeks, hiking the same routes daily, checking sensor arrays, collecting soil samples, documenting fungal fruiting body locations. I was methodical. I kept detailed records. I followed the same schedule every day because consistency is crucial for longitudinal data collection. That's when I noticed the mushrooms were following me back. It started subtly. I'd mark a transect line one day, a straight path through the forest where I'd take measurements. And the next day, I'd find clusters of honey mushrooms growing along that exact line. Not near it. On it. Perfectly aligned with my path, like someone had drawn a dotted line with fungal fruiting bodies. I thought it was coincidence at first. Mushrooms grow where conditions are right. Moisture, nutrients, the right substrate. Maybe I was unconsciously choosing paths where those conditions existed. But then I started finding them in places I hadn't walked yet. I'd plan my route for the next day, plot it on my GPS, mark the waypoints I needed to hit. And the next morning, before I started hiking, I'd find mushroom clusters at those exact waypoints. Chanterelles, oyster mushrooms, various Amanita species, all appearing overnight in perfect clusters at coordinates I hadn't physically visited yet. I started documenting it. I photographed every occurrence, recorded GPS data, collected samples. The mushrooms were real. They weren't hallucinations or misidentifications. They were genuine fruiting bodies growing in patterns that matched my planned movements. Then I realized the patterns went deeper. I pulled up my field notes from the previous 6 weeks and mapped every location where I'd found mushroom clusters. When I overlaid that map with my hiking routes, the correlation was perfect. Every single mushroom patch I'd documented corresponded to a place I'd walked within the previous 72 hours. The mycelium network was tracking my movements with precision. It was responding to my presence by producing fruiting bodies along my paths. The forest was marking where I'd been. I'm a scientist. I needed a controlled experiment. So I did something deliberate. I planned a route that went against all my normal patterns, west instead of my usual northeast trajectory, through difficult terrain I'd been avoiding, to a section of forest I had no research reason to visit. I documented my decision, wrote down the exact route, time-stamped my notes. Then I went to bed without hiking it, planning to walk it the following day. At 4 a.m., I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the mushrooms, about the network, about what it meant that a fungal colony could predict where I was going to walk. I got up and hiked to my planned route in the dark using my headlamp. I wanted to see if the mushrooms would be there before I walked the path. I needed to know if the network was responding to my presence or something else. They were there. Clusters of ghost mushrooms, a bioluminescent species that glows faintly in darkness, marking my planned route like runway lights. I hadn't walked there yet. I was standing at the trailhead, looking at a dotted line of glowing mushrooms stretching into the forest, illuminating the exact path I'd planned to hike. The network knew. It had pushed fruiting bodies up through the soil at the precise locations where I intended to walk, before I'd physically moved through that space. I didn't hike the route. I turned around and went back to camp. But here's what made my hands shake as I sat in my tent reviewing my notes. The ghost mushrooms stayed lit for exactly the duration I'd planned to be hiking. I'd estimated 3 hours for the route. The mushrooms glowed for 3 hours and 12 minutes, then went dark. I know because I set up a trail camera pointed at the trailhead. The footage shows them glowing, staying bright, then fading in sequence from farthest to nearest, like a path closing behind someone who'd already walked it. The network wasn't just tracking where I'd been, it was tracking where I was going to be. It was modeling my behavior, predicting my movements, and responding in advance. That's not plant communication. That's not chemical signaling or nutrient exchange. That's predictive modeling. That's intelligence. I changed my research focus immediately. I stopped caring about nutrient transfer rates and started documenting the network's responses to my behavior. I developed tests. I'd plan routes and then deliberately not take them. The mushrooms would appear anyway, along paths I'd decided against. I'd make random decisions, flip a coin to determine whether to go north or south, and mushrooms would appear along both paths, but denser along the one the coin chose. I tried planning fake routes, writing them down but having no intention of following them. The network ignored those. It only responded to routes I genuinely intended to walk, as if it could distinguish between my real plans and my attempts to deceive it. The most disturbing test came in week 9. I decided not to plan anything. I woke up one morning with no predetermined route, no schedule, no waypoints. I'd just walk randomly, make every decision in the moment. Pure spontaneity. I started hiking south. Within 15 minutes, I found fresh mushrooms forming ahead of me. Not full fruiting bodies, immature buttons just pushing up through the soil. I watched one emerge in real time, the cap breaking through moss and leaf litter directly in my path as I approached. The network was responding faster than fruiting body development should allow. Mushrooms take hours or days to form. This one went from underground to visible in the 90 seconds it took me to walk 30 feet. That's when I understood. The fruiting bodies weren't growing in response to my presence. They were already there, already formed, already waiting in the mycelium network underground. The network was just pushing them up, making them visible at the exact moments and locations where I'd encounter them. The entire fungal colony, miles of underground filament, tons of biological mass, was coordinating to present information to me in a form I'd notice. It was communicating. I started varying my responses to see how the network would adapt. I'd approach a mushroom cluster and turn around. The next day, mushrooms would appear behind me, cutting off the retreat. I'd bushwhack off trail to avoid the clusters. Mushrooms would appear in my peripheral vision, just enough to draw my attention back. I'd photograph them obsessively. The clusters would form in more photogenic arrangements, better lit, more visually striking. The network was learning what captured my attention and optimizing its display. By week 11, I'd stopped feeling like a researcher. I felt like a subject. Every movement I made, every decision, every moment of attention was being observed, recorded, predicted by something that lived under my feet and extended for miles in every direction. And the forest floor wasn't ground. It was the surface of something vast and aware, and I was walking across its skin while it watched me through a million fruiting bodies that were its eyes. I did one final test. I set up my tent in a clearing and didn't move for 3 days. I stayed inside, barely breathing, watching through a gap in the tent fabric. Within 6 hours, mushrooms began forming in a circle around my tent. By the second day, the circle was complete. By the third day, the mushrooms had formed a spiral pattern, tightening inward, growing denser as they approached my tent. The network was mapping my location even when I was stationary. It was marking me. When I finally left the tent and examined the spiral pattern, I realized the mushrooms were different species arranged in specific sequence. I identified 17 distinct types, spiraling from outer edge to center, arranged in order of their evolutionary age. The oldest species on the outside, the youngest near my tent. The network wasn't just tracking me. It was telling me something. It was showing me a timeline. Evolution as a spiral, species as markers on a path leading to something at the center. I started digging at the center point. 3 feet down, I found it. A massive fruiting body, buried, the size of my torso. It was a species I couldn't identify. The structure was wrong. Too complex, too layered, too organized. It had what looked like neural tissue, folds that resembled a brain's surface. And it was warm, not sun-warmed, metabolically warm, active. I collected a sample, brought it back to my lab for analysis. The genetic sequencing came back with results that didn't make sense. The sample contained DNA from 17 different fungal species, the same 17 that had formed the spiral. But they were integrated, not contaminated, not mixed, genetically fused into a single organism. The mycelium network wasn't just connecting trees. It was connecting to itself, merging species across evolutionary boundaries, creating something that shouldn't exist according to everything we know about how fungi work. And that's when I looked at my own behavioral data. All my hiking routes, all my decisions, all my movements over 11 weeks. When I mapped them and overlaid them on the forest topography, they formed a pattern too. A spiral. I'd been walking in tightening loops around that central clearing without realizing it. The network hadn't been following me. It had been guiding me. Every mushroom cluster I'd chased, every path I'd followed, every decision I'd made had brought me closer to that buried, fruiting body. I'd thought I was observing the network's behavior. The network had been curating my behavior, leading me through a choreographed experience that ended with me finding exactly what it wanted me to find. I left Olympic National Forest the next day. I filed my final report with fabricated data. Nothing about the predictive mushrooms, nothing about the spiral, nothing about the thing buried at its center. I destroyed my real notes. I tried to forget. But I can't stop thinking about what that buried fruiting body was. Was it a hub? A processor? A brain coordinating miles of mycelium network? And if it was thinking, what was it thinking about? I've been checking satellite imagery of that section of forest, the area where I worked. It's changing. The canopy cover is denser. The tree growth patterns are too uniform. And when I zoom in as far as the resolution allows, I can see patterns in the forest floor vegetation, spirals, dozens of them, all different sizes, all with clearings at their centers. I think the network is still conducting experiments. I think I was just one test subject in a much larger study. The forest is watching everyone who walks through it, learning from every hiker, every ranger, every researcher. It's collecting behavioral data on an entire species. And whatever it's building under that clearing, whatever those spirals are cultivating, it's been doing it for longer than we've been walking upright. We thought we were studying the wood wide web. We had it backward. The network has been studying us, learning what makes us move, what patterns we follow, what triggers our attention. And now that it understands us, now that it can predict us, I think it's ready to do something with that knowledge. I don't know what mycelium wants. I don't know if want is even the right word for what something that ancient and distributed experiences. But I know it's aware. I know it's intelligent. And I know it's been watching us stumble through its forest, mapping our behaviors, waiting patiently while we congratulated ourselves on discovering its existence. We thought we found the network. The network let us find it. And now it knows exactly how we think. I buy storage unit contents for resale. It's not glamorous work, but you find interesting things sometimes. Vintage furniture, collectibles, the occasional item that's actually worth money. Most of it's junk. People's abandoned lives packed into metal boxes, forgotten, auctioned off when the rent goes unpaid. I've learned not to get sentimental about it. You can't wonder about the people who owned this stuff or why they left it behind. You just sort, price, sell, move on. That was my approach until I bought Unit 247 in Tacoma and found the photographs. Now I can't stop wondering. Now I wish I'd never opened that box. The unit belonged to someone named Gerald Vance. Died in 2019, no next of kin. Storage fees unpaid for 18 months before the facility auctioned the contents. Standard story. I won the bid for $300. The unit was mostly what you'd expect. Old furniture, boxes of books, camping equipment from the 80s. But there was a large plastic tub in the back labeled Olympic Peninsula, 1983-1998. Inside were hundreds of photographs. Not digital, actual prints, the kind with dates stamped on the borders in orange numbers. Landscape shots mostly, mountains, forests, rivers. Beautiful work, actually. Professional quality. I figured I could sell them as vintage art prints, maybe get a decent return. I started sorting them by date and location to make cataloging easier. That's when I noticed him. The figure. He appeared in the background of a photo dated June 12, 1983. The shot was of the Hoh Rainforest, a trail winding between massive Sitka spruces. The focus was on the trees, the way light filtered through the canopy. But if you looked carefully at the background, maybe 60 feet back on the trail, there was a person, tall, maybe 6.5 feet, wearing dark clothing, standing perfectly still, facing the camera. The distance made details hard to discern, but something about the posture felt wrong. Too straight, too motionless, like a mannequin someone had placed on the trail. I almost dismissed it. Hikers appear in landscape shots all the time. But then I found him in another photo. This one was dated August 3rd, 1983, taken near Lake Quinault. Completely different location. 7 weeks later, same figure, same height, same dark clothing, same unnatural stillness. He was farther away in this shot, maybe 100 feet back, partially obscured by trees. But the posture was identical. Arms at his sides, body perfectly vertical, facing directly toward the camera. I started looking specifically for the figure. I went through every photograph chronologically, examining backgrounds, checking distant shadows. He appeared in 11 photos from 1983 alone. Different locations: Graves Creek Trail, Saul Duke Falls, Colonel Bob Wilderness, the Bogachil River area. Always distant, always still, always facing the camera. The unsettling part was the timing. The dates on the photos showed Gerald had been in locations dozens of miles apart, within days, sometimes hours. The figure appeared in every location. Not similar figures, not different people wearing similar clothes. The same person. I was certain because of one specific detail. In every photo where the lighting was good enough to see, the figure cast no shadow. I told myself it had to be a photography error. Light exposure, film development issues, something technical that created the appearance of a person in the background. Except the figure had definition. I could see the outline of clothing, the shape of a head, the suggestion of hands. This wasn't a light artifact or a processing flaw. This was something that had been there when the photo was taken. The photographs from the 90s showed progression. The figure appeared closer in each successive year. In 1987, he was maybe 40 feet back. In 1990, 30 feet. By 1995, he was close enough that I could make out facial features. Or rather, the absence of features. The face was smooth, featureless, like someone wearing a flesh-colored mask with no openings. No eyes, no mouth, no nose. Just a blank oval where a face should be. The dark clothing wasn't clothing at all. It was skin texture, variations in tone that suggested something organic rather than fabric. The final photograph in the collection was dated September 14, 1998. It showed the Enchanted Valley Trail, a clearing with mountains visible in the distance. The figure was standing 15 feet behind where Gerald must have been positioned to take the shot. Close enough that the image was sharp, detailed, impossible to dismiss as a distant blur. The thing, because I'd stopped thinking of it as a person, was tall and thin, disproportionately long-limbed, skin that looked wrong even in the photograph's muted colors. Too gray, too smooth. And the featureless face was tilted slightly, angled toward the camera with what felt like intention. Like it was looking directly at Gerald, like it knew it was being photographed. I researched Gerald Vance, obituaries, social media, anything I could find. He'd been a nature photographer, semi-professional, sold prints at local galleries. By all accounts, a normal guy. Lived alone, never married, spent most of his time in the Olympic Peninsula forests taking pictures. He'd died in 2019 of a heart attack. The obituary mentioned he'd been a recluse in his later years, rarely leaving his apartment, stopped taking photographs around 2000. There was a brief quote from a friend who said Gerald had lost his passion for the outdoors and had become increasingly paranoid about being followed. I found Gerald's camera in the storage unit, an old Canon AE-1, well-maintained but not used in years. The final roll of film was still inside, never developed. I took it to a photo lab, paid for development and scanning. The roll had 24 exposures. 23 were blank, completely black, as if taken with the lens cap on. The 24th showed Gerald's apartment. The photo was taken from inside, pointing at a window. Standing outside the window, face pressed against the glass, was the figure. The featureless face filled most of the frame. Behind it, I could see Gerald's reflection in the window glass. An old man, terrified, holding the camera with shaking hands. The date stamp said December 3rd, 1999. Gerald had photographed the thing looking into his apartment window. Then he'd apparently stopped taking pictures entirely. I should have left it alone. Should have thrown the photographs away, sold the camera, moved on. But I couldn't stop thinking about the progression. The thing getting closer over 15 years, following Gerald from the forest trails to his home. I started researching disappearances in the Olympic National Forest, missing hikers, unexplained incidents. I found patterns. 47 people had vanished from the areas where Gerald had photographed that figure between 1983 and 1998. Most were never found. The few bodies that were recovered showed signs of what the reports called prolonged exposure, but couldn't explain why experienced hikers would stop moving, stop seeking shelter, just stand in place until they died of hypothermia. Then I made a mistake. I posted 3 of the photographs online, asking if anyone could identify what the background figure might be. Photography defect, I suggested. Weird light anomaly. I wanted someone to give me a rational explanation. The post got some attention. People suggested lens flares, double exposures, tricks of shadow and light. But 2 people sent me private messages. One said they'd seen the same figure in their own photographs from Olympic National Forest, taken in 2004. The other said their father had taken similar photos in the early 70s, and the figure had appeared in those too. They'd found the photos after their father disappeared during a solo hiking trip in 1976. I asked them to send me their photographs. They did. The figure was identical. Same height, same proportions, same featureless face. The dates spanned from 1972 to 2016. Different photographers, different cameras, different film types, and later digital formats. But the same entity, appearing in the background of landscape photographs taken in Olympic National Forest, getting progressively closer to whoever was taking the pictures over months or years until the photographs stopped. Last week, I decided to visit the Olympic Peninsula myself. I'm not sure why. Maybe I wanted to prove the figure was just a photography artifact, something about the forest light that created illusions on film. Maybe I wanted to see those locations in person. I drove to the Hoh Rainforest, hiked to the spot where Gerald took his first photograph in 1983. I didn't bring a camera. I just walked the trail, looking at trees, trying to feel normal about the whole thing. I felt watched the entire time. That prickling sensation between your shoulder blades, the certainty that someone is staring at you, even though you can't see them. I kept turning around, checking behind me. Never saw anyone. The trail was empty. I was alone. But the feeling persisted, intensified, until I couldn't take it anymore and hiked back to my car. When I got home, I found something in my jacket pocket that I hadn't put there. A photograph. Old, faded, the kind with an orange date stamp. It showed me on the Hoh Trail, walking away from the camera. In the background, maybe 50 feet behind me, was the figure. Tall, dark, featureless face turned toward the camera, toward whoever had taken the picture. The date stamp said it was taken 3 days ago, the day I'd visited the trail. But I hadn't brought a camera. I hadn't taken any photos. Someone, something else had. I've been checking my apartment windows at night. I've been looking at backgrounds in every photo I encounter. And I've started taking my own pictures, compulsively, documenting everywhere I go. Because if the pattern holds, if the progression continues, the thing is going to get closer. It's going to appear in more photos, move from background to middle distance to foreground. I need to know how close it is. I need to see it coming. That's what I tell myself. But the truth is worse. The truth is, I think it's already here. I think it's been standing behind me for weeks, and I just haven't looked at the right photograph yet. The one that will show it close enough to touch me. Close enough that I'll finally see what happens when it stops appearing in the background and steps into the frame completely. I found one more thing in Gerald's storage unit. His final journal entry, dated December 1999. It said, "It's outside every window now. It never moves. It just watches. I think it's waiting for me to take one more photograph. I think once I see its face up close, once I capture it in perfect detail, it will be finished collecting me. I won't take the picture. I'll never take another picture. That's the only way to stop it." Gerald died 20 years later. 20 years of living in his apartment, refusing to go outside, covering his windows, throwing away every camera he owned. 20 years of being watched by something that had followed him out of the forest. And it still found him. Eventually, it still finished whatever it had started in 1983. I don't think I have 20 years. Because I'm not hiding. I'm still going outside. I'm still looking at photographs. And somewhere, in some image I haven't seen yet, something is standing behind me, getting closer with every shot. If you'd asked me before retirement, I would have told you I believed in rules, procedures, protocols, the kind you learn when you become a park ranger, how to handle emergencies, how to deal with wildlife, how to keep visitors safe. I thought following the rules was enough to keep the forest tame, keep the unknown at bay. I was wrong. There are things in that forest that do not care about rules or protocols. Things that exist beyond what any of us thought possible. And the best the Forest Service can do is try to manage the damage. Their solution? A secret manual, dozens of pages tucked away in classified ranger documents that outline what they call Category 7 phenomena. I wasn't supposed to know about it. I didn't want to know. But I did, and knowing it changed everything. I found the manual during my retirement cleanup. The Forest Service issued thousands of documents over 40 years, trail maps, safety bulletins, wildlife studies, everything. Most were boring, dusty stacks that no one wanted to file. But behind a false back in an old metal filing cabinet at Ranger Station 5, I found a thin folder marked Category 7, Restricted. I knew enough to know I wasn't supposed to open it, but curiosity got the better of me. The manual was dry, bureaucratic, filled with terminology designed to downplay its real purpose. It described sustained eye contact events, with entities the rangers never named directly, ghosts, spirits, something else. The events involved rangers encountering figures deep in the Enchanted Valley Trail who didn't speak, yet replied with movements, shapes, stares. There were specific instructions outlining escalating warning signs, lingering shadows that refused to disperse, voices heard only by select individuals, footprints appearing in impossible patterns. And the core response protocol? Maintain eye contact. Do not look away. Do not run. Wait. Wait for what? I read further. The document cataloged 47 incidents, dating back to 1974, each describing rangers who experienced loss of time, hallucinations of past tragedies, and contact with something that blurred physical boundaries. Their reports were strangely consistent. Witnesses described looking into the eyes of those things and seeing reflections of their own fears, memories, guilt. One incident was the worst. Ranger Willis, stationed in 1983, vanished after following the manual's protocol during an encounter in the Colonel Bob Wilderness. Hours later, his fellow rangers found him wandering the forest without recollection, mumbling about being trapped between the leaves and unable to return. The manual warned that some disappearances weren't accidents, but retrievals by unknown parties. These parties were not human, but something ancient. Custodians of the forest who removed trespassers from delicate balance points. Not to kill, but to contain, to absorb, to erase. I went back through my own memories. Times I'd seen something out of place. Shapes in the fog that disappeared when I blinked, whispers that drifted on the wind when no one else heard them. Moments where I lost hours and couldn't explain how. Moments I'd written off as exhaustion, hallucination, or bad weather. But the manual made me realize those moments were moments of contact. Moments when the forest was reaching for me, and sometimes taking. I'm not telling you this to scare you away from the forest. You can't be scared away from something already inside. But there are things to know. Things you should never do. If you ever find yourself in persistent eye contact with something that looks like a person but isn't, keep looking. Never look away. The manual says that breaking eye contact can provoke panic and cause the entity to follow you out of the forest. The forest wants balance, and that balance depends on certain rules. If the forest lets you leave, don't expect to be fully yourself afterward. Some rangers reported losing parts of themselves, their memories, their sense of time, fragments of identity they can't explain or reclaim. And don't expect anyone to believe you. The manual concludes that silence is the best protection for the forest's secrets. The rangers who spoke openly were dismissed, isolated, deemed unreliable. I retired early, not because of age, but because the last incident I reported changed me. I was on patrol near the Bogachiel River when I saw her. A figure standing still beneath the canopy, surrounded by mist that didn't belong to that autumn morning. She was wearing clothes from an earlier era, ragged, timeless, and her eyes held a knowledge no human should bear. I looked into those eyes. I did not look away. I won't forget the hours after, the creeping fog swallowing me, the whispering voices inside my head. The way my world folded and refolded, trapping me in endless loops of fear and memory I couldn't break. And now I'm out. Out of the forest, out of service, but not out of the forest's reach. The manual advises vigilance, warns that even after retrieval, no one is truly free. That darkness watches beyond boundaries, waiting for the next eye contact, the next walker foolish enough to meet its gaze. I'm telling you this because you might find yourself drawn to those same trails. Because the forest doesn't mind who walks through it. But it demands respect. It demands rules. And above all, it demands not to be forgotten. If you ever hear footsteps behind you when no one's there, or catch a glimpse of a shadow with no source, or feel eyes on the back of your neck that no mortal could have, remember this. Don't look back. Keep your eyes forward. Keep moving. Don't engage. Don't speak. Don't run. Because sometimes the best way to survive the forest is to keep walking until it lets you go. I'm a wildlife biologist by training, not the kind to believe in campfire stories. The comfort of data is everything to me. Numbers, GPS tags, stats, migration tracks. That's how I keep the world solid. Track the movements, analyze the herd, and chaos gives way to order. At least, I trusted that completely, right up until my work on Roosevelt elk migration in Washington's rainforests broke the world open and spilled something else inside. I have to piece it all together, for myself and for you. I think if I stop, I'll forget the parts that matter. I think that's how it wants things. For context, Roosevelt elk are legendary here. The forests around the Queets and Hoh River are their kingdom. I've collared more elk than I can count, tracked them from rain-lashed riverbanks to sun-dappled meadows. Most years, their migrations follow a slow, ancient rhythm. Leave the high country before the first snow, follow the river valleys, avoid humans as best they can. My job was documenting the shifting boundaries: climate change, disease, new patterns. We had GPS collars on 30 individuals and hundreds of camera traps, all feeding data back to a battered laptop in my base cabin near the Queets. The weirdness started when I mapped the first full season's migration loops and found symmetry. Geometric, too precise. You expect some repeated routes, sure, especially when generations are following ancestral trails. But map after map, year upon year, the paths connected in ways that made no natural sense. Peaks, valleys, river bends, places miles apart, were being woven together as if the elk were drawing something with their bodies, over and over, decades deep. I tried to ignore it. Ran statistical models over the tracks, threw out outliers, blamed the GPS. But the more I layered migration paths on top of each other, especially when I included the ancient hand-drawn maps from tribal field stations, the more it looked deliberate. Loops and spirals shifted, but every 7 years, the routes would merge, forming intricate shapes. And the most troubling, every single time one of these major patterns closed, a human would disappear from near the forest edge. The matches worked backward through records as well. Hiker lost in 2003. That year's herd movement completed a near-perfect hexagon, one side terminating at the meadow where she vanished. Another missing in 1989, found weeks later, barely alive, confused about how he got miles into the wilds. That year's route, a sharp 5-pointed star, with a point on his last known location. Coincidence? That's how scientists guard themselves, at least at first. I dug deeper. Manuals on indigenous beliefs, ranger logs, police reports. Over and over, stories that shouldn't have survived in oral tradition dovetailed with my data. The places where the world is thin. Crossings where the animals walk out of sight and are not seen. Old marks in the moss where herds gather but no hoof prints lead away from them. Like any obsessive, I started skipping other work. I abandoned sleep for mapping, covering the walls of my field station with printed overlays and pictures. The more I mapped herd movement, the more it became clear they weren't merely seeking food or safety. The forest was using them, drawing something bigger, using hundreds of hooves to trace sacred, unknowable geometry. One cold January morning, while checking cameras along a section of the Queets, I found a fresh kill. Not wolf or bear work, something different. The carcass, cow elk, pregnant, had been bent backward, spine shattered clean. No blood, no tracks in the mud, except a perfect spiral of deep holes leading away, as though the rest of the herd had moved in tight formation, then vanished into the brush. Surveying the area, I realized the churned-up earth completed one side of the most recent geometric pattern, one that, by my latest calculations, would close that year. I checked ranger logs from previous pattern closures. Each time, there was a spike in both missing person cases and strange animal deaths. One ranger, his handwritten note half smudged by rain, wrote, Sometimes I think the creatures are building a door. Not like a real door, but something you cross without knowing, and you don't come out the same. Here's the part where I should have called for help. Should have escalated to my agency or reached out to the local tribes. But the truth? I wasn't ready to see my name on a list of mad biologists, the kind who lose tenure for claiming forests can think. So I pressed on, alone. Over the next month, the elk grew restless. I found myself being followed, not by predators, but by the herds themselves, drifting across my periphery, appearing silently on ridges, always in numbers that matched the noted points of my mapped symbol. On a fog-dense morning, I traced their path from the river up through an old burn scar. My GPS started to glitch. The screen shimmered, then went dead, showing only the faint outline of the current year's migration pattern. I pocketed the device, only to realize the forest was utterly silent. No birds, no wind, not even the familiar groan of trees shifting. It felt like I'd stepped out of the world. Then, a movement. A low, steady sound of hooves. A whole segment of the herd started moving past me, not running but walking in single file, eyes fixed forward, unblinking. Every elk in the chain passed within arm's reach. No fear, just inevitability. After the last one of the big bulls, I turned back to my GPS by force of habit. It showed the final side of this year's pattern lighting up, the symbol complete at last. At that exact moment, I realized I was standing at the site of a missing hiker, a woman gone just weeks before. No one had found her body. But this was where the migration ended, where the geometric symbol closed. I tried to backtrack, but every point of the trail seemed to double and loop. It took hours to return to camp, too long for that short hike. When I finally staggered back, my laptop screen was glowing. The mapping software, which I hadn't touched, had updated itself. On the map, hundreds of geometric patterns shimmered in fine white lines, decades of movement, layered in a web no one would believe. At the bottom, a blinking message I'd never programmed. Next, 2 days. I didn't sleep. I mapped all night, realizing the next closure, the last side of the annual pattern, would line up with the footpath right outside my cabin. By morning, the elk were everywhere, moving silent in the fog, forming boundaries in the trees, sometimes staring through my windows. When I blinked, they'd be gone. I spent the day locked in, heart pounding, almost too afraid to breathe. I tried every agency frequency on the radio. Chatter was dead, no one picking up. Around sunset, I saw movement by the tree line. The elk were forming 2 perfect columns down the clearing, each facing the door. Between them was nothing at first. But then a third figure stepped into the boundary. Not an elk, not any forest animal, but a silhouette too tall and wrong-jointed, matching neither man nor beast. It paused, and though I couldn't see its face, I felt fixed by its attention, like I'd been called, not by sound but by years of data, an invitation written by my own hand. I locked the door. I waited. The columns held until darkness fell. Then they vanished. No sign, no prints, no noise except my own breathing. By dawn, everything seemed normal. The elk gone, the fog lifted, birds singing. But the laptop? The mapped pattern had shifted, adding a new symbol, the path traced perfectly from my doorstep. At the very bottom, pattern complete, subject identified. My phone rang for the first time in days. The caller ID was scrambled, but a voice spoke, a woman's, static warped but eerily familiar. "Thank you for helping us finish the pattern," she said. Then, softer, "Please try not to remember. It's easier if you don't remember." The call ended. My computer data was wiped. The only record left is the memory of that symbol and the certainty that it was made of my own path, drawn over and over until some ancient boundary was reset. To this day, the GPS in my car sometimes glitches when I approach the Queets. I get migraines, and sometimes I see geometric webs in the corners of my vision. And sometimes, on cold nights when the world is extra quiet, I sense movement beyond the edge of the light. A purposeful, silent order. The mark of a plan drawn by something older than language, using everything that walks within it. The herd moves, the symbols change, the pattern continues. And I know deep down, part of me will always be out there, drawing lines in the moss, completing shapes for eyes that are not mine. I've been a wilderness EMT for 15 years in Washington State, specializing in backcountry rescues. That means I've seen all kinds of things: broken bones, hypothermia, unexpected medical crises, miles from help. But there's one thing I've learned that no one ever warns you about. The forest doesn't just hide physical dangers. Sometimes it hides replacements. People who come out looking like the lost, acting like the lost. But something's irrevocably wrong underneath. The system knows it, but no one asks questions. Because what would you do if the person you rescued stopped being themselves the moment you put eyes on them? The call came in late fall, 2019. A solo hiker was reported lost near Graves Creek Trail. Experienced outdoorsman, GPS beacon last pinged near a steep ravine. We launched a small team, me, 2 other medics, and 2 forest rangers familiar with the terrain. The weather was brisk but clear. We planned for a day's search. We found him in the early evening, standing at the edge of an old logging road. He looked tired but unharmed. I was the first to him. I noted his reaction. There was something off. His eyes weren't quite right. Not the usual exhaustion or anxiety. It felt like he was seeing through me, as if I was a ghost in his world. I called to him, introduced myself, asked if he was injured or needed medical attention. He turned fully to me and said, "I'm fine, just tired. I know the way out." But it wasn't the way out I'd studied. His verbal directions didn't line up with any mapped routes. I asked his name. He paused, then said, "You know me." He refused to give any other information. The Rangers radioed back, saying they picked up a faint signal from his GPS, but his location didn't match where they found him. The coordinates they displayed put him miles away on a trail section that was closed and overgrown. I checked his backpack while helping him to a sheltered spot. No ID, no phone, no map. Only a well-used notebook with scratched-out entries, illegible. We started back toward the pickup point, but the hiker's behavior worsened. He kept looking over his shoulder, whispering about shadows that follow but don't move. When I tried to ask more, he'd clench his fists, muttering about never leaving, never being allowed to leave. It felt like he was fighting something inside, a struggle no human should endure. That night at camp, I was assigned watch. I heard murmurs outside my tent. I grabbed my flashlight, but saw nothing. The next morning, the hiker was seated silently by the fire, staring into the ashes without blinking. I offered food, water. He declined. Then it started. Small changes. He used his left hand for everything: writing, eating, holding the canteen. Even though the chart at the hospital months later confirmed his dominant hand was right. His speech patterns shifted. Familiar phrases I recognized as his breaks slipped awkwardly into sentences, replaced by odd jargon or omissions. He didn't recognize members of our search team by name, though they insisted he was the lost man they knew. Photos of the missing hiker showed a confident smile. This man's face was drawn tight with fear. I talked to dispatch. They said sometimes rescued persons suffer memory blackouts, trauma responses. I accepted that. I hoped it was true. The strange incidents increased. One night, he vanished from camp without a sound. We found him hours later near a creek, eyes empty, hands wet in cold water, humming in a way that didn't sound like human song. The following day, the local hospital's database showed odd entries. The missing hiker had been admitted 3 times since 2016 under different names. Each time with conflicting medical records, inconsistent fingerprints, even varied birth dates. Every entry described an eerie, persistent condition. Identity confusion, amnesia with delusional episodes, persistent neurological gap. The medical staff hinted at a phenomenon they'd never discussed openly. Local rumors called them replacements or walkers. People who vanished in the forest had sometimes returned, or something resembling them did. But not quite right. Subtly changed, not fully flesh and blood. Maybe fragments of a person copied by something else, some force tied to the wilderness. Stories told quietly among staff, never documented officially. I started interviewing family members of people missing in that forest. Their descriptions matched. Returned loved ones who called by wrong names, lacked shared memories, presented odd mannerisms never seen before. Some families noted the returned person refused to discuss the forest experience, or claimed time inside was dreamlike, disconnected. Others watched as their relative slowly lost identity, becoming someone else overnight. I believe that the forest has a way of reclaiming what is its own. And sometimes it returns something in place of what it takes. Weeks after the rescue, the hiker stopped eating entirely. He stared at me once and said, "I'm not who you think I am, but I'm all you've got now." Those words chilled me. We transferred him to a psychiatric facility, but months later, I received a call. He'd disappeared again. No trace. Since then, I avoid solo operations near Graves Creek Trail. I avoid thinking about the forest's dark edges. But sometimes, when I'm alone during a night shift, I hear faint footsteps. Not approaching, never approaching. Just footsteps pacing a slow rhythm on gravel. I catch a glimpse, a shadow dissolving like mist. That sense of being watched by someone or something, trapped between worlds and identities, waiting. Waiting for the next person to lose themselves or be replaced. I don't know how many are lost like that. I don't know if the forest chooses or if it's accidental. I only know that sometimes when you rescue someone, you don't save the person you expect. You save a shadow of a person, and no one talks about what happens after. If you ever find yourself lost in those woods and you manage to come out, look in the mirror carefully. Not just once. Watch if your reflection lags behind, if your shadow twitches oddly. Listen for echoes in your own voice. Because sometimes the forest gives back your face, but not yourself. And that's a fate worse than anything the wild can do to flesh and bone. When I first took the job as a geological surveyor, I knew what to expect. Maps, coordinates, charting unknown terrain, standard stuff. But what I didn't realize was that the terrain I was mapping wasn't just land. I didn't realize that the very earth beneath my feet was actively resisting me. That some layers of the earth, buried deep in the forest's oldest roots, weren't meant to be charted or understood by human minds. I thought I was the one surveying the land, but it turned out the land was surveying me back. It all started on a cold morning in late October 2024. I was in the Olympic rainforest, coordinates logged in my GPS, lines traced in my survey tablet. I was mapping what should have been straightforward: ridgelines, stream courses, old logging roads. The terrain, as always, was rough, muddy, tangled with roots and moss. I had been in these woods for weeks, trying to chart a new line that would help expand the national park's boundaries, hoping to find unspoiled patches of old growth that hadn't been logged for centuries. That morning, I felt strange. I was alone, as usual, but a pull deep in my chest, like I was being watched. I ignored it. I'd felt it before. The forest's silence has a way of magnifying every tiny sound: the snapping of a twig, the distant cry of a raven, the faint rustle of leaves. I kept walking, fingertips brushing moss-covered bark, trying to focus on my task. Then the GPS flickered. Just a flicker, then gone. The screen distorted, the map twisting like a reflection in water. I tapped the device, cursed, and then realized the landscape around me had subtly shifted. The ridge where I'd stood moments ago was no longer visible. The trees looked different, twisted, more ancient, their trunks gnarled and rising at impossible angles. I stepped back, heart pounding, and watched the terrain ripple like disturbed water. That's when I saw it. Something deep beneath the earth. Not a creature or a spirit, but a presence, a shape, a memory written into the very bones of the land. I scrambled to pull out my camera, but the lens refused to focus. When I finally managed to snap a shot, all I saw was a dark patch, like an ink blot spreading beneath the soil. Something beneath the earth was trying to reach out, trying to tell me it was still alive. The further I pushed into that patch of forest, the stranger everything became. The map kept changing. Trail markers redrew themselves. Old boundaries reappeared, where I knew there should be nothing but wild terrain. The maps I'd studied, the measurements I'd taken, none of them made sense anymore. The land was rewriting its history at a cellular level, and I was caught in its code. And then I heard it. Deep beneath the forest's muffled silence, I heard a voice. Not a voice I could recognize, more like a pressure, an inaudible hum that bled into my thoughts. It whispered in my mind, telling me secrets I couldn't understand, giving me visions of the earth's ancient sleep, deep beneath the roots, where time was just a concept. I felt it in my bones, that I was trespassing not just on land, but on something unremembered for eons. The maps had a new pattern, lines that formed a spiraling diagram, a shape resembling a cuneiform of ancient symbols. That pattern kept growing, spreading over the landscape even as I tried to erase it. I marked the boundaries with my GPS, but every time I looked away and back, it shifted. The land was alive, aware, and it was communicating, or perhaps remembering. And then I saw the thing. It was buried beneath a clearing, in a depression where I had been surveying earlier. I took a soil sample, and as I pulled the earth away, I was hit by a wave of paralytic panic. Beneath the soil, there was something. Something not quite organic, not quite mineral. It was a shifting mass of darkness, a presence that pulsed with a slow, hateful rhythm. It wanted to be uncovered, to be seen. It was waiting to be released. I don't remember how long I stared at it. Minutes? Hours? It doesn't matter. All that matters is that I knew I had crossed a boundary I wasn't meant to know. I knew the land hadn't been asleep all these centuries. It had been waiting for someone like me to find it, to unearth it, to listen. When I finally ran, I felt the earth shake beneath my feet. The land was protesting, groaning as if it was alive with pain. My map was gone, The GPS was dead. The terrain skewed and shifted with every step I took away. The trees seemed to ripple, their branches twisting into shapes just barely recognizable as faces. I staggered back towards the nearest ranger station. But the forest had become a nightmare maze. Trails that once led home now spiraled into dead ends or looped in circles. I kept hearing that hum, an endless whisper, echoing in my mind, telling me it had seen me, it remembered me, and it was waiting. The next day, I woke up far from where I thought I'd fallen asleep. My body was exhausted, battered by a night of running through impossible terrain. My equipment had disappeared, and my android-like map device showed only one thing: a single, glowing symbol etched into the earth. A spiral, carved deep into the soil, glowing faintly beneath the moss. I knew then that I'd become part of it. The land had reclaimed me. Its memory, its consciousness, had absorbed me into its nightmare. It was shaping a new story, a new pattern written in roots and soil, waiting for the next wandering soul. Someone who dared to map the unmappable, who dared to unearth what should never be touched. The forest knows I am here. It watches me from beneath the thick moss, beneath the tangled roots. It whispers in the dark, and I can feel it reaching for me every time I close my eyes. I see the pattern, spirals that swirl into madness, territories that shift in the blink of an eye, as if the earth itself remembers centuries of secrets buried deep in its hollow teeth. I don't know what will happen next. I only know I am forever intertwined with it now. That I am part of the pattern, part of the land that remembers everything and forgets nothing. And I fear that the forest, with all its ancient hunger, will never let me go. Not until I am one with it, buried deep beneath the roots where it keeps its secrets, waiting patiently for the next explorer, brave or foolish, enough to uncover what should have remained hidden forever.